Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. Recently, there was a YouTuber named Ed, who goes by the name of the Rabyd Atheist. His real name is Ed Rabyd, and he posted a video in which he was responding to a entitled "5 Questions Where Removing Religion Gives Better Answers." Now, I should explain that Ed Rabyd is kind of a sad story. For a number, like many even atheists, he was a former evangelical. In his particular case, he used to be a Pentecostal preacher, and but he was entertaining doubts about the faith all the while he was in the pulpit. He eventually switched over to a liberal church, and then eventually just gave up on the faith altogether. And so now he's an outright professed atheist. He rejects the divine command theory of morality, and yet he says at this point he really doesn't know what the basis of morality is. And of course, I would argue that that's one of the problems with atheism, that it makes it virtually impossible to establish a coherent moral policy. But recently he did this video entitled 5 Questions Where Removing Religion Gives Better Answers. And what he was responding to another YouTuber who put up a video entitled, "You Need to Know These 5 Questions." And the 5 questions are these. Number 1, how did I get here? Number 2, why am I here? Number 3, how should I live? Number 4, how should I deal with moral failure? And number 5, where am I going when I die? And these, of course, really are some of the great basic existential questions that all of us as human beings have to face at some point in our lives. And so basically what we're going to focus on today is the Rabyd Atheist response to question number 1. How did I get here? And so he gives the obvious secular answer. He says he got here by evolution and by his parents. Okay? And then he goes on to try to argue that evolution somehow provides a better answer than creationism. And what he does is he raises a question in particular about what he calls human exceptionalism. He says that the problem with religion is that it gives you as a human being a sense of superiority. And then he goes on to say, because, you're the special creature that was made in the image of God, and you're going to rule over all the animals out there, and so that kind of puffs you up and makes you proud. And so then he goes on to argue that somehow or other, atheism forces you to be a better person. And at one point in the video, he says, it means that whether or not I have value will be based far more on what I do, and have little basis in simply that I exist. My ego has to take backseat to my actually having to do something to help people and make us a better world, not any notion that I'm special because God created me. Now, on the surface, that sort of sounds like a plausible argument, but let's take a close look at it and see what it is. First of all, let's see what the Bible actually says on the subject. So we'll turn to Genesis chapter 1, and we'll look at the creation account. And reading from the New King James Version, we're going to start in Genesis chapter 1, and starting with verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over everything living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, see, I have given to you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food. Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. Now, it's interesting here that, first of all, it says that God made man in his image. And I think that that's really significant because first of all, applies that, first of all, it says, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. And so what that suggests, first of all, is that the idea of humanity originated first in the mind of God. Okay, and so what that means is that there's a human essence that defines us as human beings. This basic concept or idea that God had about creating a human being. Or to put it another way, contrary to the modern existentialist, that essence precedes existence. Okay, the humanity started as an idea in the mind of God, and what that means is that in the sight of God, every human being is a human being. Okay, and has value in God's sight. And it doesn't make any difference, how well educated you are, how much money you've got in your stock portfolio, how many Olympic gold medals you've won. In the mind of God, a human being is a human being is a human being and has inherent intrinsic worth in God's sight. And we should therefore treat all human beings with dignity and respect as a result. And then it goes on to say in verses 26 and 28 that it says that God has let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air. Again, in verse 28, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over everything that moves on the earth. And this is important because it implies that human beings, unlike the animals, were created with the ability to think and to reason and to make decisions and to choices and to plan and to organize things. And then it goes on to say in verses 28 to 30, it says, then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And so basically you have God communicating verbally with these human beings. And so that implies something else about human beings that makes us unique and different from just brute animals, is the fact that we can communicate verbally. So then, when you take a look at all of this, then what makes human beings different from animals? Well, first of all, there is the ability to think abstractly. As human beings, we have the ability to think and to reason, and in particular, we have the ability to grasp the reality of things unseen. In other words, we can contemplate abstract ideas. We can think about God. We can think about angels. We can think about heaven. We can think about abstract concepts such as goodness, righteousness, justice, and so on. And animals don't have that, okay? Then second of all, we have the ability to communicate verbally. The very fact that I'm talking to you now on YouTube is a demonstration of my humanity. And then as human beings, we also have a sense of morality, that we have this sense of right and wrong. It's not just simply a matter of survival and going out there and doing what we have to do to scratch out an existence and get ahead. But rather we have a sort of a sense. And unfortunately, we're kind of hypocritical in the way we demonstrate this. In Romans chapter 2, Paul talks about how that, we accuse others and we excuse ourselves. We take a look at some of the things that other people do, and there's just something intrinsically that bothers us about that and tells us that's just disgusting, and that's horrible. But then at the end, sometimes we wind up doing the same things, and then we try to come up with excuses. So why do we accuse others and excuse ourselves? Well, it's because we have this sense of morality, that there are just certain types of human behavior that are objectionable. And so we have that sense of morality. Whereas, with animals, a lot of times it's just nature red with tooth and claw. It's a struggle for survival. And then it's kind of interesting that we also have the ability as human beings to express ourselves in music. And this is kind of fascinating. You can ask the question, why does the human ear hear sounds on a musical scale? And how do we hear harmony? And I think it's kind of interesting that in the 20th century there were some classical composers who try to take their secularism out to its logical conclusion and argue that the musical scale's tonality was just an artificial man-made construct. It's just the way we've been conditioned to think and to hear things. So they tried to write some odd tonal music, and it sounded just absolutely horrible. And finally, you get somebody like Aaron Copland to realize if you want anybody to actually listen to your music, you better write it in tonality. But that raises a question. Why does the human ear hear musical sounds that way, you see? And how can we hear harmony, that you can combine sounds and they create this rich and beautiful harmony? And why is that? And it's because it's ability that God has given us. And so then, of course, you have the ability to actually compose and to perform the music. That somebody like Handel could sit down and, write out and conceive of music in his idea and write it down on a piece of paper. And then you have all these talented musicians that can compose it. And so there's so you ask yourself, when did you ever see a chimpanzee play a violin sonata by Beethoven? That's a distinctively human capacity that we have that animals don't have, and it's something that sets us apart from the created world. And because why did God create us to be able to do music? Ultimately, it's to be able to praise Him in music. And I think that there's a sense in which we're no more fully human than when we're singing a hymn of praise to God. Because then we're entering into that we conceive of God, we can consciously enter into His presence, we can express that praise verbally in language, and then we can set that in music and set it to music, and you're no more fully human than when you're singing the Hallelujah chorus of Handel's Messiah. So then that brings us back to the question. So it is true that there is a sense in which the biblical account of creation does make me feel more special than the lower forms of life on the planet. Okay, I'm different than the dog or the cat or the horse or the goat or whatever that we have here on our property. And so does that make me proud? Well, there is a sense in which it does make me feel more special than lower forms of life on the planet. But at the same time, there's a sense in which if we're not atheists, and if we have a real sense of the sovereignty of God, and we consciously enter into the presence of the infinite, eternal, all-powerful, and holy God, that should deeply humble us. And it could be argued that atheism is what actually leads to pride, because it basically means that you're at the top of the food chain. And then, of course, when you basically what it is that the Rabyd Atheist tries to argue that supposedly removing religion gives us better answers to these great existential questions. So then the question is, okay, so does atheism give us a better answer on these things? And it turns out that the problem is that once you remove God from the picture, then all of a sudden you're faced with some really serious philosophical problems. And in particular, I think that what has happened in modern secularism, atheism, and this goes back to like the Enlightenment of the 18th century, is that you actually wind up with two diametrically opposed atheistic viewpoints. So on the one hand, there's what we could call scientific atheism, or naturalistic materialism as it's sometimes called. And this basically looks at things from a very, very scientific perspective. And so it says that nothing but physical matter exists. Everything is bound by this endless chain of causality. It says we came into existence through a blind, impersonal, natural process, and that we're just basically biological organisms. And it also means that our mental processes then are simply the result of, chemical reactions taking place in our central nervous system. So we're nothing but just physical organisms. But what does that do to us as human beings, you say? Does that really seem to do justice to what we are and our ability to think and to reason and to be conscious of ourselves and other people around us? So then you've got an opposing atheistic viewpoint, what we could call humanistic atheism or irrationalism. And we see this today in basically the kind of existentialism and postmodernism. It kind of traces its roots back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the late 18th century. And then you see it crop up its head at the end of the 19th century in Friedrich Nietzsche. And then it gave rise to existentialism and postmodernism. And so what the humanists do is that they basically start with their own individual self-consciousness, and then they try to reason out from there. And so then they wind up arguing that existence precedes essence. Okay, we live in an irrational, amoral universe. We exist as autonomous beings. Therefore, we're free to define ourselves any way we want to. There are no universal truths. There are no moral absolutes. We just exist. And then the problem with that then is that it leads eventually to social chaos. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in the world today. In particular, what happened was that this particular type of irrationalism, this kind of humanistic atheism, basically surfaced in the form of radical feminism, in particular Simone de Beauvoir in her book The Second Sex, and where she tried to argue that gender roles are totally artificial and man-made and so on. And the problem there is that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If a woman doesn't have to conform to any kind of a gender role, why should a man do that? And so now, how in the world do you ever make a marriage work? Because in a marriage, each spouse is counting on the other spouse to fulfill a role in his or her life. And the result is what we see going on today is that people are confused about what their gender is, and we see the breakdown of the family structure. And what happens is that this leads to social chaos. And that's what we're seeing in the streets today. Now, in conclusion, on the surface, the Rabyd Atheist argument sort of sounds logically plausible. It certainly destroys the humanistic view that there's something special about humanity. We're just animals that have evolved from lower forms of life, according to him. In reality, as I say, when we remove God from the picture, we lose any sight of moral accountability to a higher power. It raises a serious question about, okay, so what ultimately determines right and wrong if we weren't put here on this earth by a creator, and who tells us, thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal. And of course, philosophers have wrestled with the question and come up with all kinds of answers. And Mr. Rabyd himself isn't quite sure himself where to come out on that. He says he rejects the divine command theory, but he doesn't know what exactly to offer as an alternative. And it is true that sometimes that atheists will say, well, you can be an atheist and be a perfectly moral person. And that is true. There's nothing that says that just because you don't believe in the existence of God that you can't be a kind and caring individual and love others. But in a lot of cases, these are people who were raised in Christian homes, and I suspect that they're living off of the fumes of Christianity. They try to behave in a very decent moral manner because that's the way they were raised. Okay, it was instilled with them in their thinking, in their childhood. But for society as a whole, secularism has led to, like I say, social chaos. Because what happens is that once you remove God out of the picture, you lose sight of any kind of moral accountability to anything outside of yourself. And at that point, most people are going to be, most people really are motivated by self-interest. But then when you remove God from the picture, it winds up becoming an unrestrained self-interest. And so you got people just going through life pursuing their own narrow individual self-interest, doing what they think is to their own advantage, and this is what's led down to social chaos. It's led to the breakdown of the family structure, and then drugs and alcohol and crime. Right now, retailers are having a terrible problem with what they call shrinkage, which is basically shoplifting and so on, where people are just grabbing things and taking it and running with it and so on. And then you get all these mass shootings and things like that, like the one that just took place in the high school down in Georgia. And so basically, how as an atheist, how can you definitely say that any of these things are certainly wrong? You see, when we're not accountable to some kind of a supreme being, then I get to do whatever I think I can get away with. Okay, and you might decide that you can decide for yourself what you think is best for you. But so can the person next door to you, who might be the drug dealer, the pimp, the crooked politician, or what have you. So then, on the other hand, you ask the question, so how do we know whether or not the biblical account of creation is true? And I would argue because it corresponds better with the reality as we sense it and experience it. I have to ask myself, on the one hand, there obviously is a rational order to the universe. There's an elaborate structure to it. And it's very, very hard to see how that could be if there wasn't some sort of a creator behind it. And I think that the evidence for intelligent design is quite good. But at the same time, when I look at myself, I realize I'm not just an animal. I'm not just a machine, an empty machine, a cog in the vast machinery of the universe. But there really is some sort of a sense in which I was created in a way that's different from the way of animals. And for that reason, the biblical account of creation actually makes more sense with reality as I personally experience it. I like the way that St. Anselm put it when he said, Credo ut intelligam, I believe that I might understand. In other words, you believe the biblical account because it offers a more satisfying explanation of reality as we actually experience it. It's sort of like the key that unlocks the door to the mysteries of the universe. And so we thank you very much for listening. We hope that you take all these things into consideration and think about who you are as a human being and where do you actually stand with God, your Creator. Thanks for listening. Bye now.